Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our session today, Protect Against Common Database Attacks with the Oracle SQL Firewall. My name is Bettina Schäumer, and I'm part of the product management team for database security here at Oracle, and I'm responsible for DataSafe. You might have heard us talking about this new feature in 23 AI called the SQL Firewall, but you might wonder, what is the SQL Firewall? Why have we introduced this feature? So that's what we're going to look at today. I'm going to introduce the SQL Firewall, what it is, and then also we will see how you can configure that in your environment. So the SQL Firewall, why we introduce it is we want to help you mitigate the risk of SQL injections. And if you're not familiar with SQL injection is really one of the most popular and dangerous database attack patterns that we're seeing. And it is in the top 10 list for application vulnerabilities. If we look at the OWASP list, top 10 list, so OWASP, that stands for the Open Worldwide Application Security Project, SQL injection are among the top 3 for the most serious risks since 2017. And what is a SQL injection? So SQL injection really involves injecting malicious SQL code into the input fields of or parameters of your application, your data-driven applications. And it's tricking the application to responding with, information that you might not want to expose, or it causes the application to take actions that are not intended by the application developers. SQL injection, most of the time, is just an entry point. So once the database is compromised, the attackers then also try to move to the next host or to other hosts in the internal network. If we just look at the number of vulnerabilities by year, and we just look at SQL injection, you can see that SQL injections were as an all-time record high last year. And even if we look at 2024, you can see that, hey, we already, we only have passed, a quarter of the year, but the numbers are almost as high as for the entirety of 2021. So we're definitely seeing an alarming trend here of increase since 2021. So what can you do to prevent SQL injection? And there were approaches already out there. So one of the approaches that's been around for many, many years is performing input validations. But even here, developers might forget to validate an input, or they might make a mistake. And we do see that vulnerabilities are found all the time. Another approach was the web application firewalls. Here, the web application firewalls definitely help you filter out suspicious HTTP traffic before it even reaches your application. But even here, we ran into issues, right? So web application firewalls are really good with, detecting, blocking any known SQL injection payloads. But when it comes to zero-day attacks, they typically can't help you, right? What is a zero-day attack? That's really if you have a new vulnerability that's unknown to its users, to its owners, to the developers, there is no mitigation for it yet, then attackers typically exploit that with these zero-day attacks. So this is why we're introducing now the Oracle SQL Firewall. You might have heard we already had a database firewall before, which is part of AVDF or AuditVault in Database Firewall. But now the SQL Firewall here is really strategically positioned. It's part of the Oracle database kernel here. So if you have an Oracle database 23 AI, it's included in the kernel, and it's really designed that you cannot bypass the firewall here. The good thing about it is it doesn't matter where your SQL traffic comes from, if it's coming over the network, if you have any local connections, the SQL Firewall will always check those commands that are coming in. And because it's part of the database, you don't have to change your clients, right? There's no client-side configuration changes that you have to do, so you can really deploy your applications as usual, and helps you with scaling across your database landscape. So what are the use cases for SQL Firewall? There are 2 main use cases that we're providing here. The first one is allowing only approved SQL statements in your database. So what that means is we're restricting the database access for a database user to only authorized SQL statements, which definitely helps you with mitigating the risk of SQL injection attacks. So how does it look like? So on the right-hand side, we have our SQL Firewall. We already have the SQL statements that are allowed for this user. My user that is actually connecting through the application is the employee search prod. And then on the left side, you see we have our HR admin. He's using the HR application. Again, the HR application now connects to my database via the employee search prod user. For this user, we know exactly which statements are allowed. The HR admin is using the application. He wants to look at some employee data. He's selecting an employee ID here. And then we're checking, yes, we have this. This statement is allowed on our list, and the statement will be executed. Now, if someone is trying a SQL injection, and as you can see, the HR admin still comes through the HR application, but now someone has changed the statement here. It has not just the employee ID, but it also has another condition, which is or 1 = 1, which is always true, right? So now all of a sudden here, the SQL statement is not on our allow list, and the SQL firewall will reject it, and it cannot be executed on the database. The second use case is that you can also limit it to only authorized database connections. So you can enforce the database connection path for each of the users. As you can see on the right, for this user, it's defined from which client IP address this user can connect, through which operating system user, and which program he can connect to the database. And this helps you with mitigating risk from anomalous access, so unusual access, or if you have any compromised accounts. And both of those use cases you can also combine, of course. So for database or authorized database connections, how does that look? So again, we have on our right side, we have the SQL firewall. Here we have defined what is the user context that is allowed for this user. Now my HR admin logs on to the HR application. We're checking, yes, this user is coming from the right IP address, from the right operating system user, and from the right operating system program, so the execution is allowed. Now, if the same HR admin is trying to use this database user to connect directly via SQL Developer, what happens is we're checking again the allowed context here, and we're seeing, oh, the operating system program is a different one than what is allowed, and we're rejecting here the execution. So how do you manage the SQL firewall? There are basically two options for you to manage the SQL firewall. The first one is with Oracle DataSafe, where we're providing you with a user interface that's easy to use. It has the advantage that you can do fleet-wide management of all your SQL firewalls across all your Oracle databases. It also provides you visibility into any violation across your databases. And because the Oracle DataSafe is a service running in the Oracle Cloud infrastructure, you can also leverage then other OCI services in case you want to set up alerts or notifications. You can do that as well. Oracle DataSafe, as I mentioned, comes with a predefined user interface for managing your SQL firewall, but we also have the typical client interfaces that we're supporting here with REST APIs, CLI commands, SDKs, etc. The other option is that you can use the PL/SQL package directly on the database. So there is this DBMS SQL Firewall package that you can use also to configure the firewall directly on the database. For both options, if you're using DataSafe or PL/SQL, you can use that for all your Oracle databases that are 23 AI. So as soon as it becomes available for all database types, you can also leverage that here in both of those tools. What I would like to do now is show you how you can manage it in DataSafe in our UI here. DataSafe supports, of course, both of those use cases. So you can restrict the database access either for authorized connections or for authorized SQL statements, or both. And then when you want to enforce the SQL firewall policy, you have two options. You can either block everything that is not on the allow list, and then we're logging the violations. Or the other option is to monitor the violations. You still allow the execution, but we're monitoring all the violations. We're logging all these violations. And I'll talk about why that might make sense also. As I mentioned, DataSafe also supports all flavors of the Oracle database. And again, SQL Firewall just available for 23 AI here. When it comes to managing or configuring the SQL Firewall, there are basically 4 steps. So you're starting with the collection. So you turn on the collection for your database user, for your in a target database, and then you would use your application as normal. So you start the collection, let your users onto the system, they should do their daily task, etc. And we're collecting all these SQL statements and the user connection details. What you might want to make sure is that if you have any monthly running jobs like payroll, or if you have any year-end jobs that are only running once a year, you want to make sure that you're also running those jobs during the collection, that you're not forgetting them on the allowed SQL statements. Then once you have the collection, you can review it. You can see, hey, what are the SQL statements that are on my allow list? What are the user connections that are on my allow list? Do I need to make any modifications? Did I maybe forget an application server, or do I have a new application server that I'm implementing? Then you can add those details here as well. And then once you've reviewed it, you can start the enforcement. And as I said, you have two options, either blocking or monitoring the violations. Why monitoring might make sense is especially when you start with a SQL firewall. You started the SQL collection, you trained it, basically. We now know which SQL statements are allowed for your application. And then you're just getting started. If you still want to make sure you didn't forget anything, you still want to refine the policy and so on, you can also start with just monitoring any violations. And then when you feel comfortable, yes, we now have everything on the allow list that should be on the allow list, then you can also start blocking everything else. And then when you enforce the SQL firewall, then the next step is to monitor any violations as well and check what is happening on your database. Before you can get started with anything, what you have to do is you need to enable the SQL firewall. And you can do that from DataSafe, or you can do that on the database directly. If you want to do it in DataSafe, if you're familiar with DataSafe, you might know our menu here. On the left-hand side, you find all the features. SQL Firewall is one of them. If you click on that, you get the target databases that are 23 AI. And then you see if the firewall is already enabled or not. Although SQL Firewall comes with any database 23 AI, you still need to enable it first if you want to use it. So here you can then click on the database, you see if it's enabled or not, and you can change it here from disabled to enabled. And also in the details, you see when it was enabled, etc. Good. Once that is done, this is a one-time task, as I said. So then you can start the audit collection. And how do you do that? Again, you're selecting SQL Firewall, and then you click on the SQL collections. And then you see this button here on top that says create and start the SQL collection. And then what you're going to do is you tell us for which database user you want to start the collection. And here you have the option to either just collect the statements that the SQL statements that the user issued directly, or you can also include any SQL statements that are issued from any PL/SQL units. Once you start the collection, what you want to do is you want to use your application. So have your users, use the application as normal. As I mentioned, make sure if you have any, monthly runs, any year-end runs, let those programs also run so that you can make sure you're collecting those SQL statements as well. And then we provide you with what we call the SQL collection insights. So here on the right, you see exactly, are there any new unique statements coming in any day? Or, you can also drill down into a day or so. And you would let the collection run typically for a couple of days, maybe even longer if it's a very complex application with many transactions. And then you would see if there are any new statements coming in over the day. And then once this graph goes down and we're seeing, hey, no new statements are coming in, then you can stop the collection. So now the next step is, once you stop the collection, first thing you want to do is generate the SQL Firewall policy here. And once you have that generated, then what you can do is you can review the values. If you ever have the need later on saying, hey, we forgot a few things, a few transactions, we haven't run through it, you can always update the SQL Firewall policy. So what you do is you start a new collection and then update the firewall policy with those new collections. But let's assume this is the first time we're running it. So we have our collection now, we have generated the policy. The first thing you want to do is you want to check the connection values here. Did you capture all application servers? Is there, as I mentioned, do you have a new application server coming into play? Then you can also add them here. Or if you want to monitor, or not just monitor, but you want to also create an allow list for your DBAs or so, make sure you capture every laptop, every computer that they're allowed to log on from. And you can update that here. You can add additional IP addresses if you forgot anything. And then the next thing is you can review the SQL statements that we have collected that are now on the allowed list here as well. Once you're done with that, then you can start enforcing the SQL Firewall policy. So here, again, you have two options. You can either block or monitor everything that is not on the allow list. And what you want to do is you want to go to the SQL Firewall policy and hit the deploy and enforce button. And then when you do, you have several options here. So first of all, you can decide if you just want to enforce the SQL statements, or if you also want to enforce the session context values, or if you want to do both. And then the next option is, do you really want to block everything? So anything that's not on your allow list will be blocked and cannot be executed. Or are you just starting and you want to make sure you haven't forgotten anything? then you can also start with just observing. We're still writing any violation to the log, to the violation log, so you can see what was forgotten. And then you can see, is it a valid statement? Should I add that to my SQL statements, or is it something that shouldn't be allowed? And then once you feel comfortable that you captured really all the allowed statements, all the session context, you can then also start and block every execution that's not on your allow list. And then the last option you have here is if you also want to write the violations into your audit records. So by default, the violations are written to the violation log, but you can also decide, in addition to the violation log, to write all the violations into the audit records, and you can keep them there as well. Good. Once you are enforcing the SQL firewall, then it's all about monitoring it. So yes, you have a little graphical overview here also on how many violations do you have. Is it a SQL violation, a context violation? But you also have a very detailed report here that you can see where we're showing you all the violations, which database did it happen, which database user, is it a SQL violation, was it a context violation, was the violation blocked from execution, was it still allowed because you're just in the monitoring mode? And you can also set additional filters here on top. You can slice it and dice it the way you want it. Maybe you just want to look at certain violations for a certain target database or a certain user or coming from a certain IP address. So you can slice and dice the data here as you need. And you can also create your own custom reports on top of that. Good. That was just a quick overview of, how you can manage the SQL firewall in DataSafe. Now, speaking of DataSafe, I also would like to spend a minute or two explaining to you what is DataSafe if you haven't used it. So DataSafe is our cloud service. It's kind of our unified control center for securing your Oracle databases, both in the cloud and on premises. And when I say both in the cloud and on premises, DataSafe really supports all flavors of the Oracle database. It doesn't matter if your database runs in the Oracle cloud infrastructure, at Cloud@Customer, if it runs in on premises or in any other third-party cloud. And what are we doing with DataSafe? So if you think about the security of your database, I'm pretty sure you're all encrypting your table spaces. You're probably also encrypting your backups. You're applying security patches, but there's so much more that you need to consider. So do you make sure that your database is configured securely, right? Because there are probably dozens of settings in the Oracle database that can have an impact on the security of your database. And then once you have it configured securely, how do you make sure that nobody's going in and changing anything and it's drifting away, right? And with their changes, it might introduce unnecessary risks. So you want to catch that. You want to know who are your highly privileged users, right? And for those highly privileged users, do you want to enable the SQL firewall policy? Do you want to understand what are those users doing? Do you need to audit certain activities in your database? How do you manage the audit records, right? How long do you keep these records? And then when it comes to sensitive data, because let's be honest, that's the only thing the hackers are after is typically sensitive information, right? And it doesn't matter if your sensitive information is customer information, if it's employee information, credit cards, email address, whatever they want to get their hands on, right? So it's important to understand what type of sensitive information do you have in your database? Where is that sensitive data stored in your database? And also, how do you make sure you're not exposing it in any copy of the production environment that you might have, right? You might have created copies of your production environment for testing or training and development. So you really want to make sure you're not exposing any sensitive information in those non-production copies. So DataSafe, that's exactly why we came up with DataSafe, to help you answer those questions and help you answer, working on those tasks or supporting you with these tasks. And DataSafe, as I mentioned, is a cloud service. So we're delivering new capabilities basically every week or every other week. But what you see here are the main capabilities. So we have 6 main features right now. SQL Firewall that we talked about today is one of them. The other one is security assessment, which quickly helps you evaluate the security posture of your database, really making sure your configuration is secure and also making sure you're preventing any configuration drift. Then we have user assessment, which helps you identify those highly privileged users. You can review, what roles these users have, what privileges, and not just system privileges, but also what object privileges these users have, what type of sensitive data can these users see. And also here, you can then set up notifications if there are any user or entitlement changes. So you might want to check, hey, if there's new entitlements, you want to check that those are valid and that they are needed for the daily tasks of those users. Then we have activity auditing, which helps you collect and store the audit records from all your databases centrally here in DataSafe. If you are just getting started with auditing, we also have predefined audit policies, predefined alerts that you can set up. And then if you ever have an incident, we have predefined reports that help you analyze the data. And the good thing is here, you can then analyze the data across your targets. You don't have to check each target database separately. SQL Firewall, we talked about. And then when it comes to sensitive data, we have two features here. The first one is sensitive data discovery, which helps you discover and classify sensitive data. We have over 150 predefined sensitive data types out of the box in areas like personal identifiable information, but also additional healthcare, financial information, and so on. So very rich library here of sensitive data types. If there's ever something that we don't deliver out of the box, you can also create your own sensitive types on top of that. And then once we know where sensitive data is stored, we have data masking. Again, this is for your non-production copies of your database. So this is really if you have a development system, a testing environment, a training environment that have, copies of the production data, you want to make sure that this data is still looking realistic, but you don't want to expose the real information. So you need to replace the data with, obscure data with anonymized data. And that is what you can do here with our static data masking. So that was just a quick overview of DataSafe in general. So if you start using the SQL Firewall for your Oracle database, all these other features are there as well. So you can also start using them as well. Coming back to the Oracle SQL Firewall. So just to summarize here, the SQL Firewall provides you with real-time protection against common database attacks by restricting the database access. And we're restricting the database access here to authorized SQL statements only, or to user connections, authorized user connections only, or a combination of both. It helps you mitigating risk from SQL injection attacks, unusual access, compromised accounts. And there are two options for managing your SQL Firewall. We looked at the Oracle DataSafe user interface here. As I mentioned before, there are also the client interfaces available if you want to use that for, REST APIs, etc. And then there's also the PL SQL package, the DBMS SQL Firewall that you can use to manage the database directly on the database. And then if you decide for Oracle DataSafe, we're delivering here an easy-to-use UI for a simplified management of your SQL Firewall policies across data targets, and then also simplified monitoring of violations across your targets. If you want to learn more, we do have a Live Labs for SQL Firewall. I hope you're familiar with Live Labs, which is a great tool for getting your hands on any of our solutions, very detailed workshops. And we have one here for SQL Firewall as well, where you can try out the SQL Firewall. It also comes with a little application that you can then try out. So you can start the SQL collection. You can use your application. We're collecting the statements, the user connections. You can then generate the policy and force the SQL Firewall policy, and then also see how violations are logged. So you can create some violations then in this workshop. We also have, you might be familiar with that, we have a YouTube channel from the Oracle Database Product Management team here. And there we also have an additional demo on the SQL Firewall. So where we also show you the use cases in a demo. So you see both detection of compromised credentials and also how you can mitigate the risk of the SQL injection. So check out that video if you want to see the demo. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for a live demo today. And then if you want to learn more about DataSafe, there is also a Live Labs available for DataSafe. That's called Get Started with the Oracle DataSafe Fundamentals. So feel free to look at that as well. This one goes really across all the features. So it has a lab for each of the features. We show you how to do data discovery, how to do data masking, how to make sure your database is securely configured, and so on. And then if you want to learn more about database security in general, there is an ebook that our team, the database product management team here for database security, is publishing. We have the 5th edition out there now, and you can download it, and it already includes the SQL Firewall here as well in the ebook. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.